how do you define wage theft? Because I think this is a term that most Americans are probably not familiar with, which is really sad because, I was reading an article this week where actually your work was quoted, and they were talking about how this Employee Free Choice Act, which we'll get to in a little bit, this Employee Free Choice Act is going to be detrimental to business community. It's going to be detrimental to workers. It's something that people on the right are very opposed to. And in this article, they said, well, if you are some person who is upset out there because you believe that unions artificially increase wages to the point where people are making far too much money for the work that they're doing, you should counter that with the kind of wage theft that's going on in this country. So what is wage theft?
Wage theft is when employers illegally don't pay workers for all the work that they do. And this happens in a whole variety of ways, and it's not it's not one or two bad apples. In fact, we've got a big orchard of problems in the nation right now. So first, it's employers not paying the minimum wage, right? The law is very clear. You have to pay the minimum wage. And 2 to 3 million workers aren't paid the minimum wage. Secondly, it's not paying overtime. Now, there are some workers who are exempt from overtime, but there are lots of workers who technically ought to be getting overtime and are not. In fact, one very conservative business think tank estimated that $19 billion a year are stolen from workers in unpaid overtime. And it really matters particularly for low-wage workers. Let me give you an example. You're a nursing home worker, and you are paid for 40 hours a week, but because you work through your lunch hour, your breaks, you work through at the end of your shift, you stay over a little bit to help transition to the next team of folks. You end up working 45 hours a week. Well, that's 5 hours a week that ought to be paid in overtime pay. You're paid $10 an hour, so overtime is $15 an hour, so you're cheated of about $75 a week. You do that, that's $300 a month. That's about $3,600 a year that you're underpaid. Well, you're making $20,000 a year. $3,600 is a lot of money, right? So the underpayment of overtime pay is a very significant issue. And, we're seeing lots of workers where their employers just will say, you may think you're covered by overtime, but I'm not going to pay you for that. Or they'll go in and the timesheets say one thing and your manager goes in and says, oh no, only 40 hours. In fact, that's the big issue that Walmart was caught for, right? So they're going to end up paying between $300 and $600 million in back wages to workers. In many cases, their managers literally went into the timesheets and changed them to reflect that they only worked 40 hours a week, when in fact they worked 44, 45 hours a week. Third big area of stealing wages is by misclassifying workers as independent contractors when they're really employees. And this practice not only steals from workers because it means that they're not getting overtime, and it means that they're having to pay the employer's share of payroll taxes as well as their own share, but it really steals from the public coffers as well, because it means those employers are not paying workers' comp, they're not paying unemployment, and so when there's problems, when the workers are unemployed, when they get hurt, they go onto the public coffers. So it really steals from the public and governments as well as workers. Then you have workers who get paid tips, and the tips are supposed to go to them, but their employers pocket a share of those tips. You see that in restaurants. You see that in a lot of service sectors. And there's lawsuits out all over the country on this. Then you have workers who work all day, like a bunch of day laborers, and some of them have the experience of not getting paid at all, right? Their employers just flat out steal. So those are some of the ways that employers steal, but every time I think I've heard it all in terms of how employers steal, I hear a new story. So
from the business person's perspective who is stealing wages from their employees, is considering the lack of enforcement, considering the lack of resources the Department of Labor has, the dwindling resources the Department of Labor has had over the last few decades. Is, from the business perspective, is it worth the risk because they figure that they're not going to be caught, and the penalties by the time that they actually are accrued will have already been made up in profits that they would have made off of the wage theft?
Well, that's been the case for the last decade. Companies could basically gamble that they wouldn't get caught, and frankly, even if they got caught, the penalties were insignificant, and they would often have to pay back half of what they should have paid in the first place. So on some level, it becomes a good business deal, right? I'm hoping that's changing. We have a new Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis, who's committed herself to enforcing the law. They're hiring a number of more investigators. We've been sort of crisscrossing the nation pushing for more enforcement staff, so I'm really excited about the opportunity for them to hire more enforcement staff. And frankly, they are trying to figure out how can you strengthen the penalties, and we're working on some legislation on strengthening the penalties. So I'm hoping we can make it not a good business practice for companies, but to date, that has been the case. The other thing that's a problem, let's say you're a ethical business person, and there really are lots of good ethical business leaders out there, and you're trying to do the right thing, you're trying to pay your workers fairly. Well, you're being undercut right and left by some of these unethical businesses. We have a group in Miami, and they had done a survey of businesses doing landscaping in nurseries, right? Growing plants and trees and stuff, which is what you do in Miami. And they found that business leaders who wanted to do the right thing couldn't, because the market was so dominated by these low-road employers. And so when we allow this to go on in the society, it undercuts ethical business leaders in ways that, is really bad.
Yeah, you mentioned, before we move on, you mentioned Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis. This seems to be one of the appointments that Barack Obama has made as president into his cabinet that progressives have been very happy about. How do you feel about the appointment of Hilda Solis, and why should progressives be excited about her as the new Secretary of Labor?
Well, one, she knows something about labor. She grew up in a working class family. She has supported labor all her life. She knows labor unions. She really has a background. Compare that to Elaine Chao, who'd never done anything to support workers in her life
right.
before she was appointed. You think, shouldn't you have some experience, right? So, we're excited. She's been very clear that she describes herself as the new sheriff in town, and we've been countering that she's got to clean up the wild, wild west right now of wage theft. So, but the other thing is, not only is she terrific, but the whole team of people that have been nominated are terrific. So you've got Seth Harris, who chaired Obama's policy positions and team in the campaign. He comes out of New York University. He's really committed on these things, and he's just gotten confirmed, so we're excited about him. The number 3 person is Patricia Smith, and she was the head of the Department of Labor in New York State, and that Department of Labor has probably been the most aggressive in going after wage theft and putting together some partnerships with worker centers that are exactly the kind of partnerships that Interfaith Worker Justice has been advocating. Her number 2 person who's really ran a lot of these creative partnerships is a woman named Lorelei Boland. She's been nominated to head the Wage and Hour Division, which is absolutely fabulous. If you stop and think about, who's the best person in the country on health and safety, at least one of the 2 would be a guy named Jordan Barab. Well, he's been made acting director of OSHA for the country. So it's just an incredible team of leadership that they've put together. And, you've got a lot of really dedicated wage and hour staff who frankly, have been just not allowed to do the kind of job I think they're capable of doing in recent years. And so I'm with that kind of leadership at the top, this strong career staff, and then, frankly, getting more staff, I think they're going to be in good position. But they, frankly, can't do it without us, which is why all of us at the local level have got to be engaged in helping stop wage theft. It's like when you've got a drug crime wave in the community. You got to have good enforcement staff, good police, but you also have to have active community volunteers helping root out this crime.